I'm Troy Thompson. Over the last 15 years, our family has worked hard to create a place we call the center of the universe. A place where our kids and someday our grandkids can come home to and laugh, have fun, learn how to work, pray, worship God, and be a place to celebrate life with all our friends. After a quarter century in uniform, I put away one set of boots for another, working on our acreage, improving the land, fixing some structures, and building new ones. We say, give back to the community, be useful, keep your hands calloused, and spread the gospel. This is a little place in a little state right in the middle of flyover country, from which cries out a voice in the wilderness to all who might want to listen, learn, and laugh along with us. This is our American dream. Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to Sunnyside. Finally! I know after almost 2 complete seasons, I know that the time I knew eventually this would happen, that there would actually be a subject that I am an expert on, or nearly an expert on. It has come to pass, to use biblical phraseology, that it turns out that I actually know of which I speak, unlike probably most of the other shows you've listened to. And by the way, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. But today I offer you some subject matter expertise of my own. I'm offering insight to all who are not aware of what the big deal is with Governor Tim Walz's National Guard retirement in 2005. I can provide insight. I can provide light. And I'm so happy to do this because, like I said, for once, I actually have expertise in a subject. You know, I've often thought about going on and registering myself as a podcast guest for other podcasters to reach out and, have me on their show. That allows me to promote this show and so on and so forth. Maybe this will be the way to do it. I don't know. I mean, this will probably pass very quickly, so probably not. But I have gotten guests like that myself. They're usually selling a book, or they are selling this, or they're selling that, or they've got some particular, or they got whatever it happens to be. And they're all experts. And I look at these websites that list podcast experts, and I'm like, I'm really not an expert in anything. I just talk about stuff that I have on my heart, in my mind, in my soul, things that I want to share, things that we do around. You know what I talk about. But friends, I actually have insight into this discussion today. Finally, something I have expertise in. Is that ending in a preposition? Probably is. Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, second-term governor of Minnesota, now the vice presidential nominee under the presidential nominee. Well, not really nominee, just the appointee of President of the United States, Kamala Harris. She selected Governor Walz not too long ago, and I was ecstatic. I was happy because I was like, are you kidding me? This is the moment that Kamala Mondales herself right into a loss. Now, we'll see what the next few weeks might bring. She's running even or even ahead in some polls from former President Donald J. Trump, which is its own thing. I'm not going to focus on Kamala Harris. She's currently the vice president, and that's a whole other thing. I don't know who's president right now. Nobody really knows, but we have a new nominee for vice president, a guy who's just a regular old Minnesotan, a good old guy. A teacher, a coach, a friend, a soldier, just a regular Joe, a guy that graduated from Chadron State University, not some fancy upscale place like Yale. No, this is Tim Walz, a man that I can't stand. Can't stand him, and it has nothing to do with the fact that now he's the vice presidential nominee on the ticket with Kamala Harris. Although that's part of it now, I guess. But it was long before that. Why so long? Why so long? Well, because of this. Governor Tim Walz was a member of the Army National Guard, and as governor of the state of Minnesota, he was actually the commander-in-chief of the Minnesota Army and Air National Guard, as every governor and territorial governor is in the United States and our provinces and so forth, or our territories and whatever. So the District of Columbia also has a National Guard, which is under a different control. But I will tell you this, friends. I was in the 34th Infantry Division of the Army National Guard. Proud to have served for 26 years. Only 23 of those were in the National Guard. The first 3 were in the United States Army. And I did my time as a field artillery fire support specialist, a forward observer. And so that is what I did. What is a forward observer? I'm going to explain some things for you because I'm reading the news and I'm getting the insights of the reporters, some of whom have been wartime correspondents, like a la, I guess, Dan Rather. Remember Dan Rather was a wartime correspondent, real tough guy from Texas down there in Vietnam and reporting on things. And by golly, we had embedded journalists throughout the entire War on Terror, which, by the way, I thought was a terrible name. We keep having these political war on like adjectives or nouns. We have the war on poverty, the war on terror, war on, whatever. Anyway, that's maybe a topic for another time. I always think it's interesting, though, that we have people that have been wartime correspondents for not soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marine, but just wartime correspondents from their CBS or ABC or CNN or whatever. And I'm sure in the bar, as they're trying to impress the ladies or whoever they're trying to impress that they're talking to, how brave they are because they were embedded with real soldiers and Marines. I was actually out there on the long-range surveillance. I had to wear a body armor and a helmet, of course, but I was right there in the fight of it, reporting on it like a real man. But now that J.D. Vance is vice president and he served in the Marine Corps and he was also a wartime correspondent, but as a United States Marine, those same reporters who had no military experience whatsoever and were so proud of their harrowing, antics as war correspondents, now, look down their nose at like, he's like, that's not even comparable to Tim Walz. And so it's funny. I mean, it is funny to me because I don't think that wartime correspondents that aren't soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines are anything more than civilians that are trying to report on a story, and they're protected by the men and women who actually have been through the training and are fighting the fight while they get their photo ops and they tell their dramatic stories and whatever they did. Not a fan. On the other hand, if every branch of the military, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines all have, probably the Coast Guard too, and Space Force, whatever that is, they have got their own, wartime correspondents. They're called public affairs officers, and they tell the story as the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, et cetera, wants it to be told and expressed collectively. So they report on what's going on. They do a lot of other things that are public affairs related in just relations with the public, wherever they happen to be, and so on and so forth. So that's a real job in the military. Now, is it an infantry job? Is it a combat arms job like the field artillery and the Cav Scouts and all of that? No, it's not. It's public affairs. So in the rear with the gear, not always. You are covering the story and you're out there. But yeah, it's a different thing. The difference was with J.D. Vance is that he was a Marine. He was called to duty. He went and he served. The difference with the current vice president nominee for the Democrat Party, Governor Tim Walz, is that he did serve for a long time, and then when he was called to serve, he bailed the hell out. And that is a big problem for me, having come from the 34th Infantry Division myself, being a part of that fantastic organization, that historically impressive organization of American heroes. And he bailed out so that he could run for Congress. So very important. It was a very difficult decision for him to make. But it wasn't. He wanted to run for Congress. He wanted to go out and get the next step for him. And he got it. He got that. And he got the governorship later on. So congratulations, Tim Walz. You did what you did. You hoodwinked enough people. But as you've probably heard, there are lots of folks that are from that period of time in the 34th ID, in the National Guard, both in Minnesota and the great state of Iowa, who aren't enamored with Tim Walz. So let's explain some things that the press is failing to explain very well. And I've listened to episodes of, podcasts for, whether it doesn't matter if it's Megyn Kelly or Ben Shapiro or whomever you happen to listen to, if you're a conservative or if you're a liberal, I don't know what you listen to. But besides that, there is a lot of, none of them are soldiers. They're not explaining it very well. So I will explain it to you as best I can. All right. Republicans right now, according to the AP, from just hours ago, are reporting that they don't like Tim Walz's military record after Kamala Harris named him as her running mate this week. They have problems with it. And here's why. Now, Tim Walz did serve a total of 24 years. He was in various units and jobs in the Army National Guard. He bumped around a little bit. It's his retirement in 2005 that is causing criticism, quote unquote, from some Republicans who are suggesting he abandoned his team to pursue a campaign for Congress. He did. As he ramped up a congressional bid in 2005, Walz's campaign in March issued a statement saying he still planned to run despite possible mobilization of Minnesota National Guard soldiers to Iraq. That's correct. The order came out to the it would be 1st Brigade Combat Team in 2005, which was primarily the state of Minnesota, but a few units from the great state of Iowa that were all part of the 34th ID. That stands for Infantry Division. And there's Brigade Combat Teams that was all restructured just prior to that in 2005, and we'll talk about that a little bit more perhaps. But they got the orders in March of 2005. They knew about it back then. And now, if you so here he made that note in March of 2005. Walz decided to retire in May of 2005. In August of 2005, the DA, and this is what the drive-by media and everybody is hanging on to, the DA, the Department of the Army, issued a mobilization order for Walz's unit. That was in August, man. And then the unit mobilized in October of that year, but then it didn't deploy to Iraq until March of 2006. So in March of 2005, Tim Walz, who was in the National Guard, he was acting as a sergeant major. I'll come back to that and what that means. He was acting as a sergeant major in March of 2005, and he was pursuing a campaign for Congress, but he might have to go to war. But then he retires in May of 2005 and continues his run for Congress because that was the most important thing, obviously. And then in August, they got the MOB order. The MOB order is the order that comes from the Department of the Army that says you are going for sure to war or whatever you're being mobilized for. Okay. And so that's when it came out. And so everybody's looking at the August date and saying, well, I mean, come on. He didn't even know that they were going for sure. Oh, he knew. And I'll explain how that happens, too. I have some expertise in this. And then the units that went in the 1st Brigade Combat Team, they didn't deploy to Iraq until March of 2006. Correct. They went to training. So from October, November, December, January, February, and then finally in March, 6 months they had in training so that they could prepare that entire Brigade Combat Team for overseas deployment in Iraq. They were stateside training up. And we'll talk about how that is not unusual. In fact, we've been doing that since World War II, or perhaps even before that. So the AP says, quote, there is no evidence that Walz timed his departure with the intent of avoiding deployment. But the fact remains that he left ahead of his unit's departure. He just, happened to leave before they left. In a statement, the Harris campaign pushed back at the GOP characterizations of Walz's service, and they also noted that he advocated for veterans once he was elected to the U.S. House. Oh, big whoop. Thanks very much. After 24 years of military service, Governor Walz retired in 2005 and ran for Congress, where he chaired the Veterans Affairs Committee and was tireless. He was tireless. He never got tired as an advocate for our men and women in uniform. And as Vice President of the United States, he will continue to be a relentless champion for our veterans and military families, the campaign said. Baloney. Before leaving Detroit, that's where Vice President Harris and Walz talked about this. They were playing up, doing some butt kissing to the organized labor group back on Thursday last week. They asked about a question. They were asked a question about Walz's record, and Harris just said, "Listen, I pray." I'm sure there was laughter involved. "I praise anyone who has presented themselves to serve our country," and I think we all should. Great answer. So there it is. Now the AP does clarify that. Back in 2018, Walz was speaking out against gun violence and said, "We can make sure that those weapons of war that I carried in war is the only place where those weapons are at," which would make people, kind of believe that Gov. Walz was, in combat carrying weapons of war. He didn't. He wasn't in combat. He was never in a combat zone. That's been cleared up. That comment suggests that Walz portrayed himself as someone who spent time in a combat zone. Well, he didn't. Now, he was in the National Guard, so obviously you are trained on the use of weapons of war. And what weapons might those be, my dear friends? Well, I'll get into that. Let's see here. Everybody in the National Guard, in the Army National Guard, I don't know what the Air National Guard does. I mean, that's Air Force. Who knows? They've even seen a gun. But we and the Army have to train and qualify every year, at minimum, on the M16 Alpha 2 rifle or the M4 carbine or whatever. And in addition to that, some people have to qualify on either the 9mm or the 45 or whatever it is that they're carrying as a sidearm. And usually the only people that are carrying sidearms are officers and sergeant majors, maybe a first sergeant now and then. But if it were up to me, I would, and I've qualified on both of those weapons, of course, and I will tell you that I'd prefer to have the rifle because the rifle can shoot people farther away from you, and also it's more accurate, and I just like it better. So, I mean, it's kind of cool to carry the sidearm, but fairly useless in combat. So, Governor Walz, before he was governor, as an acting sergeant major, who was really a first sergeant, which is what I was, or technically a master sergeant. I was a first sergeant. He was a master sergeant. Then there was probably just a side. He could have just maybe had a sidearm. But he was in the artillery, which is a combat arms group. Now, how does that work? So in the military, in the Army, I'm going to speak specifically about the Army, you have groups of units that are categorized by combat arms, people that are forward, that are in combat, that are fighting the fight face to face to destroy the enemy. People like the infantry, the field artillery, Cav scouts, the scouts, the cavalry in general, all of those. So, your armor brigades and that type of thing. Those are people that are involved in what we call combat arms. Now, that's a smaller group overall. You have a much larger army to support those combat arms. And that's why you have combat support units, all right, that are also things like, aviation, things like that can make things blow up and do amazing things. Combat engineers always say that I'm a combat engineer. Like, yeah, you probably are as a slice element. And then on and on and on. And then there's a group called the Combat Service and Support. All right. And so, how you get your toothbrushes and your underwear and your food and your bullets, your beans, all of that stuff across the combat service support. Different elements. It's kind of how we break it down sort of three ways. All of the jobs in the Army fall into some of those things. So some of them are in the rear with the gear, as we like to say, which is where a lot of people and probably most people are. And then some of them are out front. Now, every job in the Army has got a nomenclature. So what that means is that you have a 2-digit number followed by a letter, followed by potentially additional identifiers based on particular skill sets that you have acquired throughout your time in that role. And so, for example, the infantry is known as the 11 series. They're kind of the base unit. Everybody in the Army at the very heart of it is an infantryman. And the reason for that is because the Army is based on taking and holding land. So everybody has to be able to get that property and do it at gunpoint, fight the fight, do whatever needs to be done to combat the enemy, to clear that area and to hold on to it, which is what the infantry does, and they do an amazing job of it. So they're the basis of the entire United States Army is the infantry, okay? That's called the Queen of Battle. Now, that's a little bit of a misnomer if you're, a little bit of a misogynist, but the queen is what you protect in chess, which is really just a war game. And so the queen of battle is the infantry. They get all the cool stuff. They get a blue disc around their insignia on their dress uniforms. They get the expert infantry badge, the combat infantry badge. They get the blue cord on their uniform. It's awesome. They get a lot of cool stuff, and it's also probably one of the harder jobs in the military because you're the person that has to go fight the fight. Additionally to that, so they're the basic. And this is not what the B stands for, but every nomenclature, the rudimentary element of that particular branch within the Army is the Bravo, the B. All right. So the infantryman, the basic unit of the infantry, is an 11B. All right. So officers have the A. That's where the A goes. 11A would be an officer, something like that. But 11B would be the basic infantryman. And then there's other identifying new alpha signifiers that go below. So the 11 Charlie, for example, or 11C would be an infantry mortarman, and on and on and on. So then you have like the 13 series would be the field artillery, combat arms. 12 series is engineers, so I don't want to leave them out because I have a lot of friends who are combat engineers. All right, and I do like to make fun of them, and they're very proud of being combat engineers. They'll tell you. So we're 13 is what I came from. 13 series are all field artillery. The artillery, the field artillery is the king of battle. Just ask General Patton. I remember as I trained at the home of the field artillery of the United States Army down in Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1995. We had a place called Snow Hall, which is a magnificent training building. I don't know if it's still there or not. That's like a long time ago. Almost 30 years ago. And that place had right in big red, the color of every branch has their own unique color. Okay, the field artillery's color is red. And at Snow Hall, it says, you ask who won the war? The field artillery won the war. And we are the king of battle. That was that's not. Patton didn't say we're the king of battle. We are the king of battle. That's me. That's all of the artillery, field artillerymen in history are saying we are the king of battle. Why? Because we can hit you from 20 or 30 miles away with an explosive device that is zeroed in and clears out an area 100 meters wide in every direction. And we can hit it over and over and over and over again. The cannon has always been the most frightening thing for most infantrymen throughout history since it was invented. And it's a great, great history. My dog, the German Shepherd, that we have named Knox, is named after General Knox from the Revolutionary War, famous for his artillery prowess. And I've got little cannons all over my house. I was not a 13 Bravo because the basic unit of the field artillery branch would be the cannoneer. All right, I am not a cannoneer. I was a 13 Fox. There's a lot of letters in between that, and they all have specific jobs. The artillery is very technical. You have jobs that are involved with meteorological. Like you have to be able to know what the wind is doing, what the dew point is. We have to know all kinds of things about humidity and blah, 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 blah. Just there's a whole meteorological section involved with that. There's radar and counterfire batteries that they spend their whole time just whipping around with radar, probably going blind. I think most of blind. Most of the guys that I knew that were in radar had gigantic, thick glasses. I don't know if they came in that way or if they retired that way, but it seems like radar might have something to do with that. So they could actually tell when some little terrorist or someone was shooting a round off from a mortar somewhere on some roof, the radars would pick that up, and then we could just zzz, boom, and blow up that building. It's amazing. The field artillery has advanced and does so many incredible things that we could laze in targets. We could be so absolutely specific. We don't use it much anymore, but we could use close air support. We could use jets to there's an old round called the Copperhead that was really cool. Well, sort of. It was very expensive, and ultimately I think they got rid of it. But you could use a laser to guide in a field artillery projectile. A cannon is just a great big gun, rifled to the right, like all of our NATO allies. Everything's rifled to the right, including our own rifles and our cannons and everything like that. They'll take a 105 millimeter round or a 155 millimeter round. They'll shove it in the breech of the cannon. They'll load it there. They'll pull the lanyard and zoom, based on how many charges it is, that's how far it goes. And then there's all kinds of different things that you can have in that round itself. You could have a high explosive that just blows up when it hits. You could have a timed round that blows up in the air so you can kill all those guys in the trenches. You could have white phosphorus, which is an amazing chemical that will burn through steel, so it's very useful against equipment and particular petroleum, oil, lubrication sites, things like that, where they have their gas. Not supposed to use it against people, but anyway, you have smoke. You have some gigantic smoke rounds that can shield the movement of an entire company or a battalion. You have illumination rounds that can light up the night sky like it's daylight so you can see what's going on. Or if we know what's going on and they don't know what's going on, you can burn out their little night vision goggles if they're using them. So it's like there's just so many. And we can lay minefields. We can lay minefields with artillery rounds, just like shooting rounds, and they drop these little mines all over the place, and after a while, they just go away because you don't want to leave them out there and have the ghost of Princess Di coming after you. So the artillery is amazing, and all of these things still exist and more. Also part of the artillery family is the multiple rocket launching system, which can clear out an entire square kilometer. I mean, that's huge. That's amazing. It's just amazing. The power of the artillery allows us to prep a target before the infantry has to go in there. So hopefully we can kill just about every one of the enemy there before we get there. And then the infantry can go in a little safer and they can clean everything up and we can hold that territory. We work together. We shoot, we move, and we communicate. Now, it's been a long time since I've been in the artillery because in 2005, after Noble Eagle 2, I became a recruiter for the Army National Guard. So I had been in the artillery as a forward observer. That's a person, a 13 Foxtrot, a fire support specialist, a FISTer, or different things. That stands for Fire Support Team. Don't get crazy on me. And that was, I love that job. You're a scout for the artillery. You go out front, usually with the infantry or whatever forward element there is, and you walk around with them. You carry a radio or you've got a guy carrying a radio with you, and your job is to battle track and know exactly where you are at all times. And by the way, when you're with the infantry, Lieutenant, a lot of times they don't know where you are. So it's handy for you to be there because you have to know where you are at all times. Why? Because if you have to call in for this indirect fire, which is from cannon, you have to be or naval gunfire. We could call in that, or close air support from helicopters, Hellfire. We could do all kinds of cool things. So we had that powerful radio with us, and that was our job. So we could protect the infantry, the forward element that we were with. And so you're usually out by yourself as an artilleryman with the infantry. That's what the forward observer does. And so we would. I loved it, and I did that from 1995 until 2005, so about 10 years. And then I became a recruiter and was hired full-time in the Army National Guard and did that until I retired in 2021 to some degree or another. With varying levels of responsibility and so on and so forth. It was a great job. I really loved it. I thought it was really cool. I loved being in the field. I loved being with the guys. I loved being the liaison between the infantry element and the artillery element, to be able to communicate, to put all of this power of the indirect fire, the king of battle, in the hands of a platoon or as a company or of a battalion of soldiers that were out there just trying to win the battle, whatever it happened to be. So that was what I did. All of the elements of every job in the military has got a 2 number and a letter nomenclature. Okay, in the military, there is the same pay grade structure for everybody, all the branches: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, the Coast Guard too, Space Force, whatever that is. And so it starts with the enlisted side, in my opinion. The enlisted side are the people that volunteer. They used to be drafted, but you could still volunteer back in the draft days. So, as my dad did, and so the enlisted side, they are, they're the grunts, the people at the lowest level, right? The enlisted side is the common blue collar working soldier, and that doesn't speak necessarily anything about their abilities, their intelligence, or whatsoever. Because I met plenty of officers who were morons. So that has nothing to do with their intelligence. It's just what they wanted to do, and they are technical. They're experts in their field. They do their job. That that alphanumeric nomenclature for whatever their job happens to be in whatever field or branch they happen to be in. And so the enlisted goes E1 to E9, and it would be private, then private E2. E just means enlisted, and that's your pay grade. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then there's a private first class. This is just the Army. The Marines are slightly different. The Air Force is way different. The Navy, I don't even know what they do over there. But it's all the same. We all get paid the same based on our pay grade, but we might call the rank a different name. All right. So getting into explaining what these rank things mean, talking about acting sergeant major, command sergeant major, all of that stuff. I'll get there. You go from private E2, which is you get a little piece of rank, we call them mosquito wings, and then you get private first class, and that's like a mosquito wings with a little rocker underneath it, so it looks like a teardrop, which is appropriate. And then you have the upside down teardrop, which is all filled in. That's an E4. That is a specialist. Okay, it can also be a corporal. The E4 pay grade is the first place in the Army where you can get a split, paid the same, but a split in rank, style, insignia, and due to responsibility. Okay, so a specialist is the most common. There are a few, particularly in combat arms, you have what's called a corporal. That's 2 stripes. Okay, those people are considered non-commissioned officers. They're the lowest rank of non-commissioned officers. They're usually bulldogs. They're in a leadership position, but they're not a sergeant. The next step then would be the E5 level, and that is sergeant. Okay, that's 3 stripes. All right, and then up on top of that, you've got, the next one will be staff sergeant. Staff sergeant is 3 stripes. Now you start putting the rockers on. Okay, so it's a little rocker on the bottom. Then after staff sergeant, and they all have different, they go up in responsibilities, the number of people you're in charge of. Like for example, a corporal, which is an E4, might be in charge of a team. A team could be, say, 4 to 6 people. And then a sergeant might be in charge, also of a team, and they could be in charge of 4 to 6 people, just kind of how they break it out. Then you have a staff sergeant could be in charge of a squad. They're typically called squad leaders. And then you have the E7, which would be the sergeant first class, and that's 3 up and 2 down. Okay. And then that would be a platoon sergeant. So that sergeant first class would be in charge, anywhere from, 20 to 40 people in a platoon, or 50 people in a platoon. All right. And sergeant first class is also the first enlisted rank where you actually start adding in an officer. That's the first time you see a lieutenant. A lieutenant then is a platoon leader. Okay, so you have a platoon sergeant, which is an E7, a sergeant first class, and then you have an O1, which would be a second lieutenant. That's where they learn how to be a good officer, by taking care of a small group of troops and applying their leadership skills that they've learned in officer training, whatever that happens to be. Okay, so a second lieutenant comes in. We'll talk about the officer structure, and we always pair up an officer with a senior enlisted person, starting at the platoon level. All right, so that sergeant first class is a platoon sergeant. He's paired with a platoon leader, who is an O1, a second lieutenant. All right, the next step above platoon sergeant on the enlisted side is, and here we split up again, same pay, different responsibilities. You can be a master sergeant, which is 3 up and 3 down. And a master sergeant is an administrative or an expert in that particular field that he's in. Like, he's the top of that particular company's responsibility or role or whatever it happens to be, an expert in that, in his career field. Then you can also be a first sergeant, and that's 3 up and 3 down and a diamond in the middle. And so I've been both master sergeant and first sergeant. Okay, you get paid the same. There's no difference in pay. The responsibilities change. The first sergeant there's only one in every company. So that is the top enlisted person in a company or a battery. Company and battery, they mean the same thing. Or troop, if you're in the cavalry. Company, battery, troop, all mean the same thing. It's an element of, say, 3 to 5 platoons. Every platoon is made up of 3 to 5 squads. Every squad is made up of, 1, 2, 3 teams. Okay, and that's how it all breaks down. So a company could have, 3, 4, 5 platoons in it. So you could have anywhere from 80 to 150 people in a company. That First sergeant is the top enlisted person in the entire company. His job is to make sure that the enlisted people are trained and they are doing their job and that they have all of their needs met, and that the NCOs, the other non-commissioned officers, all those other sergeants we talked about, are doing their job and leading their troops and have what they need to be successful. Tim Walz was a master sergeant. All right. I don't know if he was ever a first sergeant, but he did get promoted. He did get the opportunity from there, not promoted, but he got the opportunity, and this does sometimes happen, where you can be an acting person at the next grade level without actually holding that rank. So, for example, you could be a staff sergeant, or you could be a sergeant E5 and be holding the job, acting as the squad leader, even though that's a staff sergeant's job. You could be a staff sergeant, the senior staff sergeant in a platoon, and there isn't a platoon sergeant yet. So you are the acting platoon sergeant as a staff sergeant, which would really be a sergeant first class's job, the E7. So you could be an E6 doing an E7's job, but you're still getting paid as an E6, but you're not really, because you're not getting paid as a platoon sergeant because you haven't been awarded that rank. And then you could be at E7, and acting as a master sergeant, or acting in that position as a first sergeant if those positions aren't yet filled for whatever reason. But eventually, of course, they always will be. Until that time happens, you can be an acting person. You're still getting paid at the rank that you currently are. You're not getting any benefits, but you get the opportunity to learn how to do that job at the next level, I suppose. So that's what the next level then, in the final level, the E9, all right, is, because master sergeant and first sergeants are E8. So we get to E9. That's the top level across the board. And so that's the sergeant major position. So there's two types of sergeant major, technically three, and I'll explain it, but there's only one of the third. All right. And it's the sergeant major is 3 up, 3 down, and a star. And that is same thing as a master sergeant, but at the battalion level. And a battalion is made up of, say, 3 to 5 companies. So that's how that works. And a battalion sergeant major, the command sergeant major, if you're with the command team, that's how you get that CSM, that command sergeant major role. And that is getting paid the same thing as the sergeant major. But this time, the star's got some a little wreath around it on the inside between the 3 up and the 3 down. So that's the difference there. And this command sergeant major works with the battalion commander or higher, because after that, it's just always a command sergeant major that is working as part of the command team with whatever officers in charge of the element that we're talking about. And that starts at the battalion level. So that's what Tim Walz would have been acting as. He was an E8 acting as an E9 at a battalion level. So he had a lieutenant colonel who would be his commander, and he would be his partner, his senior enlisted advisor, so to speak, as part of that command team in a battalion. That's how that works. And so it would continue to do that if you got to the next level, which would be brigade. That would be a colonel, or sometimes a brigadier general, would be a 1-star, and they would also have a command sergeant major. At the division, you would have a command sergeant major, and on and on and on and on and on. So you get to the top, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, 4-star general, and that's as high as we go now. We do have 5, but I'll get back to that in a second. And so that will also have a command sergeant major of the Army. And the command sergeant major of the Army is getting paid the same thing as the command sergeant major at the battalion level. Maybe a little bit more, because you do get paid the longer you've been in. You get paid by years in service in rank. Okay, that's how everybody gets paid the same. And so the sergeant major of the Army, there's just one of those across the entire Army. So there you go. And they have little different, titles for different things and all of that stuff, but that's basically how it works. So those are the 9 ranks, the 9 pay grades, the multiple ranks of the enlisted side of the United States Army, including the Army National Guard. There's also a group called warrant officers. They're between the enlisted and the officers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. There's just 5 levels of those guys. They are technical experts in their particular branch, their field. Okay, and the officers go from 01 to 010. So they've got a little bit more. So you've got the first level we talked about already, be a second lieutenant, which would be in charge of a platoon. Then you got a first lieutenant. Then that means that person is usually moved into like an executive role in a company. They often are called the executive officers. Then you have the company commander level is an 03. That's a captain. That's where you get the captain in the Army, is an 03. Then an 04 would be a major. You move back into a kind of administrative executive role in a battalion, a staff position. And so then you learn all of those different roles. And the officers wear wear all kinds of different hats as they learn all of the different elements of leadership in a company and level as they continue to go on. After major, then you go to the lieutenant colonel. Lieutenant colonels are in charge of a battalion. Not always. I mean, they move into staff positions as well once they've hopefully had their time as a leader of a battalion. Beyond that, you go to the full bird colonel, which is the 06. That's, full bird, a little eagle. That is, pretty good. I like a lot of colonels. I think that's where I think that's the top-notch officer level. Beyond that, 07 is a brigadier general. That's 1 star. Major general is 2 stars. You've got lieutenant general, and then you've got, which is 3 stars, and then you've got the 4-star general. And then there is the 5-star general of the Army. And we've just had about 5 of those in the entire history of the United States Army. So those are the ranks. And I explain a little bit how they work together. So if you didn't have a battalion sergeant major in the position yet, a command sergeant major, you would pick somebody who was in the running potentially to be in that position. So you would I would expect a competent person to be brought up to that position. To become a sergeant major, every level beginning with sergeant, the E5 level, as a non-commissioned officer, requires additional training and schooling. And it continues all the way through. You have to eventually go and complete the Sergeant Major's Academy in order to become a Sergeant Major. And you would do that as a Master Sergeant or as a First Sergeant. There are a variety of NCO courses that you have to take, non-commissioned officer courses you have to take to get each of those positions. And you have to have them in advance now that things have settled down. In the heat of the war, after 9/11, we started, getting things mobilized and pushing things around and changing the structure and all of that stuff. And it was hard to get people to the schools they needed. So we were promoting people without having gone to some of those schools. And sometimes they'd be acting. But when you got to the level of sergeant major, you really are talking about you got to get done with the sergeant major academy. Tim Walz was in the sergeant major academy and he quit. He didn't finish it, so he could never have been an actual sergeant major or a command sergeant major. He couldn't have done that. So he was acting in that position, and I don't know if he was, waiting to finish it or if he was, maybe this is all whatever, but he decided that, he was going to run for Congress. He had other things going on. So here's the deal with how, and that's fine. Like he can be an acting sergeant major. People would respectfully call you sergeant major if you were acting in that position. You wouldn't call him master sergeant. He wouldn't be a first sergeant because he's not in charge of a company. But so it would be he's a master sergeant. But you would, if you knew he was acting as a sergeant major, you would respectfully call him sergeant major. And you don't call somebody who's a sergeant major command sergeant major or sergeant. It's just sergeant major. All right. So people would stand at parade rest when they talked to him, and they would, which you would do anyway if you're talking to a non-commissioned officer at any level, and then you would say, Sergeant Major Walz, whatever, even though he was a master sergeant. So when you retire, you keep your highest grade that you attained as long as you held that rank for 3 years. So Tim Walz would have had, in order for him to retire as a sergeant major, he would have had to have held that rank for 3 years. And he didn't. He was never a sergeant major. That didn't happen. So hopefully that clears that up. He was just acting in that position. But some people have said he could not have possibly known that they were going to deploy to Iraq because he mentioned something about it in March and he retired in May. They didn't get their mobilization orders until August, and they didn't actually go to Iraq until the following March. That is just civilian nonsense. Because I will tell you that at the highest level of a battalion, so and up from there, and even at the company level, information filters down as well as upward. But when it comes to mobilization orders and rotations of mobilizations and deployments, you're going to know probably a year in advance. Now, that wasn't necessarily the case in 2001. Right? 2002, when we moved into Afghanistan, we started the Iraq War in 2003. Totally different subject for another time. So by 2005, we had restructured the Army into brigade combat teams, and that means that divisions had brigade combat teams, and they were just organized a little bit differently, kind of on a regimental basis, but bigger. And the idea was that you could pick up a whole brigade combat team and move them around and deploy them, and they would be ready to roll. They train together, they fight together, you fight as you train, etc. Anybody in a sergeant major position probably in a master sergeant position, and obviously any officer over those grades would know if something was coming down the pike. Why? Because those are the people that determine training, and we determine training a couple of years in advance. So at the time 2005 comes around, the 34th Infantry Division, of which the unit he was a part of, the 1st and 125th Field Artillery in Minnesota, they hadn't been deployed necessarily for any combat mission up to that point. They had done other things. There was airport security missions. There were things that it mentions that he did go to Europe. Oh, he took the European trip, went to Italy. That was pretty. I mean, whatever. Who wouldn't go to Europe? Come on, man. And supported the efforts that were in the combat area from Europe, which is. I don't discredit that. Like, who wouldn't go to? That's, good times, but not the same. Obviously, not the same thing. Then he got home, and then he's now acting as a sergeant major, and he knows damn well that this unit is going to go to Iraq. They know it. It isn't official. I guarantee you that the soldiers at the lowest level had an inkling about it. The NCOs at the next level probably had an idea of what was happening. And then certainly the officers in the companies and at the battalion level were aware of what was going on. Absolutely at division level, they knew what was going on because they have to prepare and allocate funds and materials and training for a deployment well in advance. So he knew. He knew because he would have been an active part in determining all kinds of mobilization exercises, training, preparation, finding personnel. They would have been rolling through every unit's personnel records, seeing who was actually technically qualified to deploy. Because even if a unit is at 100% strength, it has all of the people it's supposed to have and all of the positions that it's supposed to have. The truth of the matter is that there's a percentage of those people who are not fit for service for some reason or another, on their way to retirement anyway, or whatever it happens to be, or they could just be, they can't pass the PT test, they might have they could have problems, and they're fine to serve on a 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks in the summer rotation, but they're not okay as a liability to send overseas to combat. They would have had to prepare their annual training as artillery to make sure that every single one of their batteries of cannon were sighted in, that they had qualified at gunnery, that they had made sure that their teams on every single cannon knew what they were doing, because that's what the Department of the Army would have expected from them. They would have had to make sure that all of their ducks were in a row personnel-wise, that they had actually the numbers that they were supposed to have, that they knew who they were going to leave behind, and they had to be able to explain why, and they had to be able to resource and open that up for people to come into. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So my point is this. He knew they were going to Iraq. He knew in March. He knew before March of 2005 that they were going to go. And he decided instead that it was more important to him to run for Congress, like Mitt Romney said when he was running for president. And I don't forgive Mitt Romney for this because it's such a BS line. A reporter asked Mitt Romney, he said, why, you don't have any military service. Why don't your son serve? At this time, we're still actively engaged in a war. And Mitt Romney's lame excuse was, it's more important for my sons to help me get elected. That's how we can serve our country. It's like, okay, ding dong, that is not what we wanted to hear. So you lost me on that one, Mitt. But this is the same thing that Tim Walz did. Now, Tim Walz did serve his country. He joined the National Guard in 1981. In April, he enlisted just 2 days after his 17th birthday. No surprise there. You can join the National Guard at the age of 17. You can go to basic training between your junior and senior years in the summer if you're not a baseball player, you've got anything else going on. And then you can do your job training, your what's called the MOS, your military occupational specialty training for whatever branches you're in, like artillery. You can do that after you graduate, and then you go back to your unit and you do your 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer. He joined as an infantryman, and he did that, must have done it OSIT, so he did it all at one time. One station unit training is what he did, and he would have gone probably to Fort Benning, as my guess, to be an infantryman. So he started out there, nothing wrong with that, loved the infantry. Then he went on and he was down in Texas. He was at the University of Houston in 1985. He reclassified as a cannoneer. That's the 13 Bravo job. The the field artillery cannoneer, and he was in the Texas Army National Guard. Again, totally normal. That's what you would do if you were from Minnesota or you were in Nebraska, is where he joined, over in Nebraska, and you're like, hey, I'm going to school in Texas. I'm going to just get transferred. It's called an interstate transfer. I'm going to transfer down to the Texas National Guard and join a unit down here, and I can keep my standing, keep my pay, keep all my benefits and stuff like that, keep going. So good. He did the right thing. He did that, and then he's in the Texas National Guard. Then he went on to the Arkansas Army National Guard, served as an instructor there a little bit later on. All fine. By the way, nothing's happening in the 80s. Nothing happens in the 80s, all right, till we get to the Gulf War in 1991. In 87, Walz returned to Nebraska, was in the National Guard there, so it goes back into the Nebraska National Guard, interstate transfers there. He's still in the field artillery. He finally completed his college degree in 1987. He went to Chadron State, had some friends that went out there, if you like rodeo. In 1996, he transferred to the Minnesota Army National Guard, all right, and then in 2003, he deployed to Italy in a support position of active military forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, but so in 2003, January 2003 is when we started the war in Iraq. Okay, so if he's in there in Italy, we were already in Afghanistan. He's just kind of helping out, whatever they're doing. Whatever they're doing over there, but they're not. It's not a combat job, and it says that he himself was not in a combat zone. Okay, so J.D. Vance's big deal is don't pretend to be something that you're not. Well, he isn't pretending that that he's a soldier, and he wasn't. He was a soldier, and he was a high-ranking enlisted soldier. He was a master sergeant, maybe a first sergeant. I'm not sure. He was an acting sergeant major. He doesn't get to be called that unless when he was in that position by respectful, junior enlisted people. But so he did 24 years of service. I don't discount that whatsoever. He wasn't in the Gulf War, but that doesn't have anything to do with anything because not everybody was in the Gulf War. They didn't send every Army National Guard unit over to the Persian Gulf. So he did his thing. And for a long time, that's what they did in the National Guard. I remember on Operation Noble Eagle 2, where we got sent out, and I'd already been in the Army, and I'm surrounded by National Guard guys. And for me, it was, I'd already been around and done Korea and Panama and different places like that. And I remember hearing people complain like, this isn't what I signed up for. This was supposed to be 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks in the summer. Wah, wah, wah. What did you think this was supposed to be? So it's not unusual for people to not be particularly happy about having to go to war. That all changed after 9/11/2001. There was no question that after 9/11, absolutely everybody knew that this was going, within a few years, everybody in the Guard knew that they were going to serve. And they looked forward to serving, believe it or not. I used to explain it to new recruits like this. It'd be like, hey, imagine being a fireman and never having to put out a fire. If you're trained to be a fireman, even though a fire can be very dangerous and it can be scary and you could get very hurt or killed, you still want to go put out a fire. You still want to get the fire trucks going and you want to go out there and do your job, which is how most service members felt. We did it for like 20 years. It got a little bit out of hand. A lot of those type of things happen. So that is. I don't have a problem with the fact that he served for 24 years, but the fact that that we cannot deny that he cut out. He can do that. So here's how retirement works. If you have 20 years, at the 20-year mark of your career in the National Guard, you will get what's called a 20-year letter. They will send you a letter that says you have completed 20 years of service. You can retire at any time. And then there's some explanation of what has to happen like that. And it's just a process. You say, I'm dropping my retirement papers, I'm saying I'm retiring, and I'm out. And you can do that anytime after 20 years, no problemo. And that's what he did. So he didn't do anything out of order. He didn't do anything that was out of regulation. But he did do something that I felt was pretty weak. It was just weak because you have the opportunity to be the command sergeant major. You're acting already as the command sergeant major. You have the opportunity to lead troops into battle, which you have not done. And you have the opportunity to take those same young men, and particularly those same young, and at that time it's all men in the field artillery, the opportunity to take those young NCOs, those young sergeants, as the senior enlisted in that battalion and guide them to make sure that they are taking care of their soldiers, that they are training their soldiers so that we come home safely. Now, he didn't do that. He thought that running for Congress was more important than taking another year to stick it out with the National Guard in that position. And I just think that's a character issue. I really do. I don't care if he became a congressman and he went out and he served on the Armed Services Committee, the veteran. I don't care if he did veterans. I don't care. Big whoop. Of course, you should do that. Okay, but that doesn't make you special. What would have made you special is if you took that deployment. Here's my frustration as well. It wasn't just that Tim Walz cut out, and he could have. He had the right to do that, so that's fine. It wasn't just that he cut out. It's that he cut out on the single, and he had no way of knowing this, so I'm not blaming on that, but this is what comes back and really bites us in the butt. And I wasn't on that deployment either, but as a member of the 34th ID and just being around all those amazing men and women who were, he cut out on the single longest deployment in the entire Gulf, in the entire war on terror. The entire 20-year period of fighting the war on terror, Tim Walz was able to escape because he dropped his retirement papers. That's why people are PO'd. They're PO'd because that wasn't a 15-month tour. It definitely wasn't a 12-month tour. It was a 22-month tour. Why? Because George W. Bush decided to initiate the surge.
If we increase our support at this crucial moment and help the Iraqis break the current cycle of violence, we can hasten the day our troops begin coming home. So America will change our strategy to help the Iraqis carry out their campaign to put down sectarian violence and bring security to the people of Baghdad. This will require increasing American force levels. So I've committed more than 20,000 additional American troops to Iraq. The vast majority of them, 5 brigades, will be deployed to Baghdad. Now is the time to act. We will disrupt the attacks on our forces. We will interrupt the flow of support from Iran and Syria. And we will seek out and destroy the networks providing advanced weaponry and training to our enemies in Iraq.
And the surge took units that were already there and kept them there until they felt that the surge had been successful. And that included the 133rd Infantry Battalion. And that's right here in Iowa. And that's in Waterloo and various other places. And I'm connected to that. That affected all kinds. All of those units that deployed in the 34th ID, the 1st Brigade Combat Team in 2005, they were mobilized. In 2006, they went to Iraq and they didn't come home until 22. The whole thing was 22 months. So he skipped out on a good one. And that's what is so dang irritating about Tim Walz and his decision back then. And he knows it. He knows it.
Progress in Iraq has allowed us to continue our policy of return on success. We now brought home all 5 of the combat brigades and the 3 Marine units that were sent to Iraq as part of the surge. The last of these surge brigades returned home this month.
He should know it because I don't see how he can look his fellow soldiers in the eye. Like, you cut out on the long... Look, that's not even unique to the 34th Infantry Division. The 34th Infantry Division has been with the history of the Midwest, the territorial mobilization in Iowa, Minnesota, the Mexican War between 1846 and 1848, Indian conflicts, the American Civil War, the Mexican border conflict, right? Chasing prior to World War I, the war to end all wars, but it didn't, and World War II, etc. World War II is where we truly earned our reputation. The 34th Infantry Division, beginning in the fall of 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered all. This is 1940, the fall of... We haven't even been bombed yet. This is 1940. The fall of 1940. It was a full year before the Japanese start doing anything, and that FDR is like, all National Guard divisions active duty for a period of 12 months. So the fall of 40 to the fall of 41. On February 10th, 1941, the 34th ID was ordered to duty, and on February 26, 1941, the 34th ID Guardsmen, then under the command of Major General Ellard Walsh of Minnesota, were sent to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. And the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, just after they'd completed their Louisiana maneuvers. Conveniently. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and America declared war. And the division was spread throughout the South, Guardsman-sensitive installations. And then on January 1st, brand new year, 1942, the Red Bulls, the 34th ID, was en route to Fort Dix, New Jersey, for subsequent shipment overseas. And friends, they went Northern Ireland, to North Africa, to Italy. And in Italy, let me tell you something. The 34th ID on the 10th of January 1944, with the 36th ID, attempted the initial crossing of the Rapido River. After 4 failed attempts and suffering hundreds of casualties, a crossing was finally made on February 1st by the 168th, the 135th Infantry Regiments, the 168th Infantry holding its ground in the vicinity of Kyra. I might say that wrong. The 133rd Infantry, kind of mentioned them, moved toward the town of Cassino. The 135th Infantry moved up the hillside toward the Abbey. The 133rd Infantry reached the city of Cassino and fought a pitched battle, but only succeeded in taking and holding little more than half the town. It has been stated by historians that Cassino was one of the bitterest large-scale battles fought during World War II. These are your Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota guys, and a little bit of Wisconsin that are part of the 34th ID. Men piled rocks around themselves because they were unable to dig into the mountainside. They needed protection. When the mortar and artillery came upon them, the rocks just shattered, created even more shrapnel. Permission was finally granted to bomb the Abbey, which many felt was being used as an enemy observation post. So as a field artillery observer, I would definitely find a place like that. 135th Infantrymen who reached the wall said that they had seen the enemy at that location in the Abbey. On the 15th of February, Allied bombers reduced the Abbey to rubble. And all said, the 34th ID was finally relieved and given a rest. Companies were so badly depleted of manpower that it was not uncommon to find rifle companies which were authorized 193 officers and enlisted men reduced to just 50 men. In several instances, only 30 answered roll call. The performance of the 34th Division at Cassino is etched deeply in the annals of military history of America. This is our division we're talking about. This is Tim Walz's division. The final 50 men, those few who had held out to the last, were too numbed with cold and exhaustion to move. They could still man their positions, but they had to be carried out on stretchers. Monte Cassino, in future years, became the yardstick by which to measure all battles. Red Bull. At the end of World War II, all the Army National Guard divisions, regiments, battalions, and units were inactivated. The 34th Infantry Division's reputation as one of the toughest combat outfits in World War II survived. Here's something that you should know. The 34th Division in World War II amassed 517 days of combat. One or more 34th Division units were engaged in actual combat with the enemy 611 days. The division was credited with more combat days than any other division in the theater. It suffered 3,737 killed in action, 14,165 wounded, 3,460 missing in action, for a total of 21,362 battle casualties from Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. The division's men were awarded 10 Medals of Honor, 98 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, 1,052 Silver Stars, 116 Legion of Merit Medals, 1 Distinguished Flying Cross, 1,713 Bronze Stars, 51 Soldiers Medals, 34 Air Medals, with duplicate awards of 52 Oak Leaf Clusters and 15,000 Purple Hearts. Red Bull. So let's talk about Iraq. Red Bull was doing all kinds of things right after 2002. We did Operation Noble Eagle. I was in on that. And then we did some other missions, and there's a whole book about it. Obviously, I'm reading from it. Went to Afghanistan, Sino, Kosovo, and Bosnia in 2003. That's probably when he was doing some things like that, maybe helping out in some, posh job over there. And then in 2005, guess what? We start our whole situation with Iraq. And as we already mentioned, we get the notification comes, mobilization comes out, and in August or whatever I said, and then they take the whole 1st Brigade combat team to Iraq in 2005. Now, the 1st Brigade Combat Team, HHC, 1st Brigade Special Troops Battalion, HHC, 1st and 113th Cavalry, 334th Brigade Support Battalion, 1st and 133rd Infantry, talked about them, 1st and 168th Infantry, 2nd Combined Arm Battalion, 136th Infantry, 134th Signal Battalion, 1st and 125th Field Artillery, Tim Walz, 1st Combined Arms Battalion, 194th Armor Regiment, 634th Military Intelligence Battalion, and the 2nd of the 135th Infantry all went as part of the BCT, the Brigade Combat Team. And they went over there. Now, here's the thing. That by this time in the Iraq War, it's been a couple of years, and what they're dealing with now is something that they hadn't really been trained to deal with. It's called the explosively formed projectile, and it's a deadly device smuggled into Iraq from Iran or made on site by insurgents from discarded or cached ordnance that they had found. The EFP is a precision cannon, a 90% chance that it will kill if it goes off. There were over 100 vehicles destroyed and 3 soldiers killed by them, which was a statistically low death rate, and that's a tribute to the protocols created by the folks that were there already, one of which was a retired Colonel Eric Kurska, who was part of 1st Brigade Combat Team S3, which is operations, and did a long deployment so he could try to figure out what was going on over there. But these EFPs, what they did was, They have this metal tube, and then you have an explosive, a propellant, and then you have this copper disc that's at the front of it. And then they would have a vehicle that drives by, it trips a sensor, and there's different types of sensors. Then that explosively formed projectile detonates, and the explosion, the heat shock wave from the detonation propels the disc, that copper disc, forward and softens it into a rod, and it, really does some damage to the vehicle and to the people in it. And so this was something that they hadn't seen. They'd certainly seen IEDs. We all remember the improvised explosive devices that we're talking about. But the biggest problem, and that was still a big problem over there, the day-to-day life of a soldier in the field was, pretty boring most of the time. And the other 5% was complete chaos, according to the folks that were there. And part of the things that they had to deal with, obviously, were these IEDs and these EFPs. They had here's a story from a fella. He says, driving along about 45 miles an hour on a 4-lane highway, and I knew this was an area where there was going to be IEDs, and I saw one, and I was about to say, stop the convoy, and we hit another one that I hadn't seen, and I found out afterwards that it was a 105 millimeter round that was somewhat buried off the shoulder, and it had a crush wire detonator. That's where they'd take 2 wires and separate them by a piece of foam, then they'd wrap it in black electrical tape, and when you drove over them, you'd crush them together, and it'd cause it to go off. And they called that the victim-operated IED because you're the one who set it off. And it was pretty so they hit that. It wasn't catastrophic. Our truck came to a shuddering halt. I was hit in the face by a tiny piece of shrapnel that snuck in between the door and the frame. The front end, the hood, was basically ripped off. The tires were blown out. All the engine compartments were leaking whatever fluid they held. And that piece of shrapnel that hit this guy, and I'm trying to think. Captain Adam Stock. He was a sergeant back then, so Adam Stock is his name. That shrapnel that hit Stock in the corner of his lip, the medic took it out, put it in a bag, so he got to keep it as a souvenir. So that's nice, Lots of stories like that from this deployment. But then what happened is that they're over there, and President Bush decides that we need to have a surge, and we end up staying there a lot longer for 22 months. The entire 1st Brigade combat team of the 34th ID, the part that Tim Walz was supposed to be on, was gone for 22 months. So not only did they set the record for World War II, they set the record for modern day. And he wasn't a part of that. And maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. Maybe he was terrible. Maybe he was not a good NCO. Although I don't think that they advance you to that acting position if you're not fairly competent. So he had the opportunity to be a leader of soldiers, and he decided to go home and retire and run for Congress and take a different job and sit over here. And that's why people are upset. Maybe it was good that he wasn't there. Maybe he would have been terrible at it. Sergeant majors don't. It's not like sergeant majors on the front battle lines anyway. It's not like, I was a soldier once and young or whatever, but I mean, he's probably riding around in a Humvee that's up armored. Most of the time he's in the rear with the gear. He's taking reports. He's doing it. It's like, it's not, even if he was the battalion command sergeant major, I mean, they'll go out, but they're not like leading the charge. I'm not saying that he couldn't have been. There certainly have been sergeant majors killed in that situation. We lost one ourselves here in Iowa. Sergeant Major Gabbard. Female sergeant major from right here down in my Boone. And there's just, a long time has passed. And it's enough time that people who don't know anything about the military, that don't know anything about rank structure, that don't know how orders come out, that don't know anything about the training operations that have to happen before a deployment occurs, that don't know anything about when you can retire, that don't know any of this stuff, like the people that are reporting on it, that don't dig into it, that don't ask these questions. Enough time has passed that most Americans have no idea what the big deal is. And the big deal to me is that a soldier wouldn't do that. But he did. He's not the only one. Lots of people do that. They see the opportunity to get out and they get out. And every soldier considers it. So it's not unusual. It's just weak. And it's kind of cowardly. He had the opportunity and he decided to take one that he thought was better. It worked out for him. And it's not surprising to me. I can't look at that guy and say, now there's an American hero. I can't. I didn't go to Iraq. I didn't go to Afghanistan. I wasn't part of that 22-month deployment with the 1st Brigade Combat Team, 34th ID. I knew many people who were. And it's just, it ain't cool, man. It was hard. And he took the easy way out. And he can say that it was, a hard decision and he really had to go over it, on and on and on. But I say BS. Now, listen to this. Here's a story of another Minnesotan who joined the National Guard at 17, like Governor Tim Walz. Kyle Miller enlisted in the Minnesota Army National Guard while still in high school. He planned to turn his passion for fixing cars into a satisfying career. He spent much of his youth with his mom living in Bird Island, Minnesota, a small town of about 1,000 people between Minneapolis and Marshall on U.S. Route 212. In his teens, he moved north about 40 minutes to live with his dad, Randy, and his stepmom, Candy. Yes, that rhymes. He moved to Wilmar.
He was one of the most caring people we've ever known.
Shortly after completing his training, Kyle was called to service with the rest of his National Guard unit in mid-2005 with orders to go to Iraq. He was assigned to Headquarters Battery, 1st Battalion, 125th Field Artillery. He sent letters home frequently, and despite the reality that he was in a hot and dangerous war zone, he was concerned with what was happening back home in Wilmar.
I asked him, "You don't regret this?"
No, absolutely not.
He didn't have any regrets about his decision. He was always worried his dad was working too hard here. We built a new house and finished out the basement, and he didn't like it that his dad was always working so hard. We'd pray for his safety every day, and when he'd call us, I'd say, "Honey, are you okay? You sound a little depressed."
I'm just tired. Mom, don't worry. I'm okay. I'm fine.
He wanted to be over there. He really thought he was doing something important.
One of Kyle's last letters was sent to his dad, Randy. It was a Father's Day card, which was Sunday, June 18th, 2006. In it, he wrote,
Happy Father's Day, Dad. I hope everything's going good for you and Mom. Everything is still going good over here. Same stuff every day. I'm glad you've almost got the basement done. Take some time off and enjoy yourself. Go to a movie with Mom or take the motorcycle out for a spin. Just enjoy yourself and have fun. Love, Kyle.
Kyle had been overseas for 3 months. On Thursday, June 29th, 2006, 11 days after Father's Day, Specialist Kyle R. Miller was killed when a roadside bomb detonated near his vehicle. He was 19 years old. Some National Guard members volunteered from other states to join the 2005 deployment, something thousands of National Guard soldiers did nationwide throughout the War on Terror. Now, these men and women were already part of a National Guard unit somewhere else. Sometimes they were in the same state, but in a unit that wasn't being mobilized, and others from clear across the country who felt compelled to be reassigned voluntarily to a deploying unit. One such member was Sergeant First Class David R. Berry, a Kansas Army National Guard soldier with over 16 years of experience and a member of the 1st Battalion 161st Field Artillery, drilling out of Dodge City, Kansas. Sergeant First Class Berry was assigned to A Battery, 1st Battalion 125th Field Artillery Regiment, with its main unit located in Pipestone, Minnesota, and its detachment located in Laverne, Minnesota, both located in the southwest corner of the Gopher State. Here's his obituary. David R. Berry's pastor, Bruce Hayes, shared some of his family's and friends' memories. One called Berry a loving, caring, silly, quiet man who dated his wife, Kathy, forever and ever, 13 years, in fact, before they were married in 2003. Another remembered him as someone who would do anything for anybody and usually had a crooked smile on his face. Berry's stepdaughter's children called him Papa. Berry, who was 37 years old, of Wichita, Kansas, died February 22nd in Kasim when his vehicle struck an explosive. He was a 1987 high school graduate and was assigned to Dodge City. He had more than 16 years of military service. He was just a very solid soldier, Lieutenant Colonel David Johnson said of Berry, who in 2005 received the highest peacetime medal that a soldier can get, the Soldier's Medal, for rescuing a motorist from a burning vehicle. He was quiet, had a good sense of humor. He was well respected by everybody. He worked as a lab technician for Farrar Corp. Family members said that he loved hunting and attending Wichita Thunder hockey games. He is survived by his wife Kathleen, one stepdaughter, and one stepson. And here's a comment from somebody who was deployed with him at the time. I was there at the FOB during that time and was quick friends with Sergeant Berry. Now, while I didn't know him well, we would have a few small conversations. I remembered how he wanted to play horseshoes. We didn't have any that we could get at the MWR, so he had some sent from home. From the time I did get to know him, Sergeant Berry was kind, friendly, and very easy to talk to. I was prior Army infantry, so that made it nice we had common grounds. Rest easy, brother. All right. So there's a couple of guys that paid the ultimate price on the deployment that were from the battalion that Tim Walz was supposed to be leading as a senior guy. It's not Tim Walz's fault that Specialist Miller or Sergeant Berry were killed. That 100% belongs on the enemy. 100% belongs on the people that set those explosive devices up. But here you had a kid who joined just like Tim Walz did And he went and he did it. He didn't have the opportunity to retire. He wanted to be there. And he paid for it with his life. And then you have another dude, Sergeant Barry, who didn't even have to be there, but volunteered. He wanted to be there. He came from an entirely different state so that he could be a part of it. And Tim Walz retired. Friends, I don't know if this brings any clarification to you. I don't know if it makes anything, if it matters to you at all. You don't care if you hate Donald Trump, who, by the way, didn't serve in the military either, got a deferment for Vietnam, blah, 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 blah. You know, fine. We can have that conversation with Kamala, who also did not serve in the military whatsoever. Wasn't old enough to get a deferment from Vietnam, but didn't do anything like Obama. I thought about it. Nobody cares if you thought about it. All right. Talk about the vice presidential candidates, J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. And both of them did their terms and they got out. The difference is, in my opinion, is that with Tim Walz, and why I just cannot stand, besides all of the nonsense that he is responsible for and the burning in Minneapolis and his failure to be a good leader of the Army National Guard and dealing with those riots and that nonsense that happened, or shutting down the entire great Gopher State. I mean, we had golfers that were coming to Iowa where at least it was freedom. The fact that he's a crazy leftist, the typical guy that is just like kind of a ho-hum, in my opinion, like a ho-hum human being who just kind of gets by in the base, whatever he does, and says the things that he needs to say, and probably thinks that it's always somebody else's fault and somebody owes him something. That's my opinion. It's really hard for me to change that because I'm too close to the situation. Not close as the guys that served, not at all. But I've been around them for a long time, and I can totally identify with what they're saying. And hopefully, at the very least, what I've done is I've made it a little clearer so that people can explain, at least to each other, what it is that the press is missing. You know, he didn't know about it. He absolutely did know about it. I guarantee he knew about it because he would have had to know about it. And he chose, because he knew about it, to get out. I mean, which is perfect that he went down to Congress, because these people that go into Congress suddenly get rich off of all these things that they have in their committee meetings, and they make all these wonderful investment decisions. He just invested in himself and took that information and got out because he could. It wasn't illegal. He did his service and he dropped his retirement papers. So make of that what you will. I hope I cleared it up. It does get me fired up. Gets me a little emotional. Now you know where I stand. And finally, I have something that I can be an expert in. Until next week, man, I hope you have the opportunity to be an expert in something for your friends and family and loved ones and, well, even people that don't like you. Until then, also, I hope you get a chance to be the sunny side of someone else's life. I want to thank all our friends and guests for stopping by for this episode of the Sunny Side of Life. All the Sunny Side of Life players who stopped by, creative support provided every day by my incredible wife Heidi and our fantastic 4 boys. Thanks to every one of our listeners. That means you. A big shout out to my brothers and sisters in uniform holding the line around the world. Share the word, folks. Let the people know what we're up to. Subscribe so you never miss an episode, and follow us on social media. All skits are written or adapted and directed by me, Troy Thompson, and are produced here at Sunnyside Farm Studios and delivered to all platforms by Buzzsprout. Music and sound effects are provided by Soundstripe. The Sunny Side of Life is a weekly production about our life on the family farmstead here in Iowa, the liberties we prize, and the pursuits which make us happy. Now, none of this is possible without Christ in our lives. For the Lord God is our sun and our shield. He gives us grace and glory. So may the Lord bless you and keep you, and may the sunny side of your life, liberty and pursuits, be in Christ, and made evident unto you each and every day, and give you peace.